back and forth, they started to think that perhaps the reason why they couldn't come up with a good title was that the game itself wasn't very easy to understand. Despite all the new modes, Nishimura was still hearing feedback that the single player wasn't much fun, and many people didn't really understand the idea of AND searches. Nishimura and Iwata asked themselves, is it really okay for us to put this game out as it is? And so, it was decided that development would be put on hold. When Shift were told this, they were shocked. It was like the rug had been pulled out from underneath them. Not to be beaten, the developers started thinking up ways to make the game more understandable. The first idea they came up with was swapping out AND search with phrase search. You see, with AND search, if you searched for Queen Elizabeth on Google, it would return any pages with either Queen or Elizabeth in them. You'd be bombarded with results about the 70s band and my gran. However, with phrase search, you'd only get results with both of those words, in this case, Her Majesty the Queen. The team thought that phrase search would be simpler to understand for players, especially those who hadn't really used Google before. But switching over would require a lot of major changes. For example, they had a game mode called Which is Higher, which presented the player with two search terms and they had to guess which one returned more results. However, if they were using phrase search, they would have to find a way to come up with a variety of interesting questions featuring phrases. Eventually, they decided to write all the questions manually. Shift hired a bunch of TV quiz show question writers and only used questions involving puns, double meanings, regional differences, in essence, unexpected or interesting questions. Now, it was around this time that Nishimura was yet again trying to get a title approved for the game. Eventually, he stumbled upon the idea of naming the game after the robot character, Andor Kensaku, and Iwata approved this name. Without hesitation, Nishimura phoned up Shift to tell them the good news. Hearing cheering from the other end of the line, he knew that they had taken the news well. And so, on the 29th of April 2010, and Kensaku was released. Development had lasted for 3 years, far longer than any of the developers had expected. But they had ended up with a final product that they were really proud of. And that's the story of the time Nintendo made a game about Googling. I hope you found that interesting, and you can subscribe for more videos like these. Plus, if you know someone who would find this video interesting, sharing it with them is a huge help to me. Right, I'll see you next week. Bye! Hi there! So, in a 2013 interview with Kotaku, legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto was asked the question, "You said you made a bad game. What was the bad game you made?" His reply? That's right, it was Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Now, compared to the other games in the series, this one stands out like a sore thumb. Rather than utilising the top-down perspective that its predecessor and many of the titles following it used, large parts of this game took place from a side-on perspective. Plus, the game included many RPG elements which later games ended up ditching, like experience points for leveling up magic, power, and life. That certainly doesn't sound like the other Zelda games, right? But why did this game turn out to be so different from all the others in the series? Well, let us find out. It was late 1980, not long after Shigeru Miyamoto's action-adventure royale The Legend of Zelda was released. Now, this game was wildly successful. Reviewers loved it, players couldn't get enough. But that didn't faze Miyamoto. Instead of beginning work on a sequel right away, Miyamoto wanted to create a brand new, totally original title. And so, he told designer Tadashi Sugiyama, "I want to make a side-scrolling action game which makes use of up and down movements for attacks and defense." And so, Sugiyama assembled a cozy team of about 10 developers to put together this unique game. They all started experimenting a whole bunch with how to create a game that fulfilled Miyamoto's request. They began production without having a solid plan in mind, but before long they came upon an idea. What if the game would switch views between an overhead perspective and a side-on view? This would make for some totally unique gameplay. However, according to Miyamoto, this idea was severely limited by the hardware the game was being developed on. Like Zelda 1, this game was to be released for the Famicom Disk System, which was great for the most part. The disk system allowed games to be much larger in size, allowing for bigger, grander adventures. However, according to Miyamoto, from a hardware perspective, if we had been able to have the switch between the scenes speed up, If that had been faster, we could have done more with how we used the side-scrolling versus the overhead view, and kind of the interchange between the two. But because of the limitations on how quickly those scenes changed, we weren't able to. If you're wondering what Miyamoto's talking about, check out this video of the game being played on an original Famicom disk system. They go to change from an overhead to a side-on perspective, and... yeesh, wait indeed. Because of this 6 or 7 second long transition every time the viewpoint was changed, the team didn't feel like they could switch the scene too often for fear of irritating players. Now, one of the most unusual features of this game were the random encounters the player would experience travelling across the map. 1 second you'd be traversing the world, the next you'd be chased down by a bunch of ominous blobs who took no displeasure in killing you as quickly as possible. So, what was the reason for this radical change? Again, it was limitation. Because of a lack of storage space, yes, even with the larger capacity of the disk system, the team needed to find a way to have the player battle the same enemies a number of times. Their answer to this? Random encounters. However, without some kind of motivation, these encounters would quickly become irksome. To solve this problem, the team added a leveling system. When you fought an enemy, you'd be able to fill up your life, magic or power bars just a little more. However, yet more limitations held back the team's vision. According to Miyamoto, it would have been nice to have bigger enemies in the game, but the Famicom hardware wasn't capable of doing that. Certainly with hardware nowadays you can do that, and we have done that, but of course nowadays creating bigger enemies takes a lot of effort, and so the enemies had to be a lot smaller than the team originally envisioned. Now, one of the biggest complaints about the game that the team received was its extremely high difficulty. However, it wasn't always going to be this way. In the final game, the player can level up their magic, life and power 8 times. Originally though, Miyamoto wanted the max levels to be double that, 16. However, as development went on, the team decided to make it a little trickier. According to Sugiyama, the foundation of action games at the time was to feel difficult for everyone. Games didn't have a ton of content at that time, so in order to have them played for as long as possible, we felt like we couldn't make them easily clearable. That wasn't the only reason though. Since the team would have to test the game again and again and again, they would get bored if the game wasn't hard enough. And so they had to keep bumping up the difficulty. Which was all well and good for them, but it meant for the average player, the minimum skill required to complete the game was very high. In fact, after the game released, Nintendo got a call from a customer who exclaimed, "I just can't beat the final boss." However, it turned out that he was fully leveled up already, so the team ended up telling him, "You can only rely on your skill at this point." Ouch. Now, as development neared the end, the team made a dramatic decision. Up until this point, the game was planned as a totally original game, not to be part of any pre-existing series. However, at the last minute, they decided the main character should be a 16-year-old Link from The Legend of Zelda instead, making this game a sequel to last year's game. Now, The Legend of Zelda stood out as a title. Rather than sounding like the name of a game, it sounded more like the name of a book or something. And so the team decided to follow suit, titling their game Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. As for the exact reasoning why they chose this name, according to Sugiyama, when thinking of a way to best describe the contents of the game, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link seemed to pass without objection. I forgot. And so, on the 14th of January 1987, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link was released for the Famicom disk system. Financially, it was a big success, becoming the long-standing best-selling Zelda game in Japan, only beaten by 2017's Breath of the Wild. Despite all this success though, Miyamoto never ended up liking this game. In a 2013 Kotaku interview, he explained, "When we're designing games, we have our plan for what we're going to design, but in our process it evolves and grows from there. In Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, unfortunately all we ended up creating was what we had originally planned on paper." Back in 2003, he reiterated, "All games I make usually get better in the development process, since good ideas keep coming, but Zelda 2 was sort of a failure." However, not all was bad. When Sugiyama was told that a number of people's favourite Zelda game was Zelda 2, he responded, "Those kind of people exist?" That's a joke, of course, but I'm very grateful when someone says that. As a game creator, that is the best compliment to receive, so thank you all very much. 30 years have passed since its release, but please give Zelda 2 Adventure of Link a try. Hi there, thanks for watching to the end. I hope you found that one interesting. Have you ever tried this game? If so, what were your thoughts? Plus, subscribe for more videos like this weekly. Plus, sharing this video with friends helps me out a ton. Right, that's all. Bye!
New Super Mario Bros. Wii doesn't quite roll off the tongue. Come to think of it, the notion of 4-player Mario doesn't seem like the most intuitive thing in the world.
The biggest addition to the Super Mario gameplay here is the multiplayer focus. At any time, 1, 2, or 3 friends can join you in your single-player adventure and help you get through the levels.
But while New Super Mario Bros. Wii feels and plays like classics like Super Mario Bros. 3, there are enough additions here, such as 4-player co-op, to make it a completely engaging title in its own right.
I think it's safe to say that when New Super Mario Bros. Wii came out in 2009, one of its standout features was the multiplayer. I mean, people had never seen anything like this from a Mario game. But did you know, Nintendo had been wanting to include this feature since a much older game? No, not New Super Mario Bros. For the DS. No, not Super Mario World for the SNES. That's right, Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES. Why didn't the feature work out back then? Well, let's find out. Hi there, welcome to Thomas Game Dogs. So, Mario 3, huh? What a game. To this day, it's still the 6th best-selling game in the series, at a whopping 17 million copies. And it doesn't take an expert to see why. This game was kind of incredible. Keep in mind that Super Mario Bros. Was meant to be the final cartridge game on the NES, or Famicom as it was known in Japan. And so, Shigeru Miyamoto and his team at Nintendo decided to give the system one final send-off, in the form of a game like the world had never seen, a game that truly pushed the Famicom to its absolute limits, Super Mario Bros. But only 3 years later, Nintendo released a follow-up that I think no one expected, Super Mario Bros. 3. Including full horizontal and vertical scrolling, beautiful new art, exciting new power-ups, a world map. It's safe to say that fans were, well, a fan of this game. I think that's putting it lightly. But before this game was what it is today, Mario 3 looked pretty different. And so, I'd like to go on a journey, looking back at how Nintendo came to make this absolute beaut of a Mario game. Let's take a look. To understand how Super Mario Bros. 3 came to be, we first need to look to this guy, Takashi Tezuka. You've almost certainly heard of his better-known counterpart, the much-loved and revered Shigeru Miyamoto. But Takashi Tezuka also played a huge part in the development of Mario, and especially Mario 3. So, who even is this guy? Well, Takashi Tezuka joined Nintendo in late 1984, 1 year after the Famicom was released. Shigeru Miyamoto, who was still relatively new at the time, took Tezuka on a tour around Nintendo, introducing him to all the other employees. Before long, Tezuka and Miyamoto formed a sort of partnership. But they were still missing someone, Toshihiko Nakago. Now, this guy is even more obscure than Tezuka, and he wasn't even a Nintendo employee. No, he worked for a company called SRD, who Nintendo would often partner with when developing games. Nintendo would come up with the designs for the game, and SRD would program them. And Tezuka, Miyamoto, and Nakago soon formed a sort of team between the three of them, known within Nintendo as the Golden Triangle. And it was this triangle that went on to develop Super Mario Bros. In 1985. Miyamoto led the project as director, Tezuka served as designer and assistant director, and Nakago headed up the programming at SRD, though he also played a large part in deciding the game's design. And I think we all know what happened to that game. It was kinda successful, just a little. And so it was decided that Nintendo would develop some kind of sequel, known in Japan as Super Mario Bros. 2 and elsewhere as The Lost Levels. For consistency's sake, I'm going to be calling the game Mario 2 for the rest of the video. This time it was Tezuka directing the game, with Miyamoto as producer. Tezuka figured that most players had at this point mastered the basics of Mario, So for the sequel, he decided to keep the basic essence of the game the same, but change the game's level design and, most crucially, difficulty. As I'm sure you're aware, Mario 2 is famous for its high difficulty. Now, after the team finished work on Super Mario Bros. 2, they naturally moved on to Super Mario Bros. 3. And again, Tezuka was appointed as director, this time alongside Miyamoto, who was co-directing, and I assume producing. These games had no end credits, so there's a bit of guesswork involved. Anyway, when he started the project, Tezuka thought to himself, we made Super Mario Bros. 2 by changing the original game's difficulty and stage design, but we couldn't do that again. So I wanted to change everything, including its general appearance. General appearance? Yeah, Tezuka had a grand vision for the game. He wanted it to take place from a whole new perspective, a sort of diagonal overhead view, rather than the side-on look of the first game. There is still some evidence in the final game which shows off a little of what it would have looked like. The black and white checkered floor. If you look closely, you can see it has a sort of pseudo 3D thing going on. That's how the entire game would have looked. However, after a while, Miyamoto came along and vetoed Tezuka's new perspective. You see, in a Mario game, it's crucial that you can see exactly where Mario is, how far his feet are from the ground. You need almost pixel-perfect accuracy. With this new diagonal perspective, you lost your sense of distance from the ground. And so, the game's perspective was switched back to a side-on view. However, this original diagonal perspective was around for a large part of the game's development, and it influenced many of the game's features. Of course, this new perspective wasn't the only part of the game that ended up being cut. There was a time when the developers wanted to include a 2-player mode. Not like in the final game where players take it in turns playing levels. No, they wanted to let you play at the same time on the same level. You see, one day Shigeru Miyamoto turned to the team and stated, wouldn't it be great to have 2 players? However, once Nakago from SRD ran some tests,